So welcome everybody. Gives me huge pleasure to welcome you to this event, looking at restorative approaches in relation to environmental justice, and particularly considering the climate crisis. I'm just going to introduce myself and then do a few housekeeping things, and then I'll introduce our speaker today, Ben Almassi. So my name's Pete Wallace. I'm a restorative justice practitioner in Oxford and also a trustee of the Mint House. And I've been given a few announcements to make in terms of housekeeping. So first of all, we are recording the event. So if you aren't happy to appear on camera, please keep your camera off during the discussion part of the event. And then we aren't able to keep your email addresses on file because of the data privacy regulations. So if you're not already on the Mint House mailing list and would like to continue receiving information for future events, then you please email Joy and she'll put her email address on the chat. We'd also love feedback on this event. So there will be a link which will be also on the chat, which you can, you can easily fill out. Just take a couple of minutes. Right at the very end of our talk, I will announce the next event rather than flagging it up now. So I'm just going to go over and very briefly introduce Ben, who's our speaker. And first of all, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. And we were just saying before some of you arrived that it's at 7 a.m. in the morning for Ben, so it's a sort of breakfast time slot, but we're hugely grateful for you, joining us at this time. Ben is an associate professor of philosophy at Governors State University, which is in Chicago, and I believe it's on the southern edge of the Chicago wilderness. And I would like to recommend Ben's book, which is called Reparative Environmental Justice in a World of Wounds. And clearly this talk today couldn't be more timely, as we're moving it literally within 2 weeks of the COP26 conference in Glasgow, at a time where literally we feel the future of humanity is in the balance. And I guess what we're thinking about here, because the Mint House is a centre for restorative approaches and restorative practice, is about the relevance of those approaches to this climate and ecological crisis that we are all facing. So we couldn't be in better hands. Ben teaches courses including philosophy, political theory, medical ethics, feminist theory and practical reasoning, as well as environmental ethics. So we're coming in from a sort of philosophical, moral, standpoint, which is, it's a really good place to start opening up these discussions on the relevance of restorative approaches to climate justice. So I'm going to hand over to you, Ben, and then we'll open up for questions later on in the talk.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Joy. Thanks to all of you for being here. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, is anyone having trouble seeing my screen? All right, well, before we begin, I'd like to ask each of us to reflect for a moment on those members of your community who are or who will be especially affected by the social and ecological consequences of climate change. Think about those members of your community, and I want to ask you to come back to these people, perhaps these places, these systems, these members of your biotic community that are especially relevant here. I want to begin today with a couple of excerpts from a speech by Greta Thunberg a couple of years ago before the UN. And Thunberg says, "You say you hear us and you understand the urgency, but no matter how sad and angry I am, I don't want to believe that, Because if you really understood the situation and still kept failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. And she ends the speech this way. She says, "You're failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you." Anthropogenic climate change is very much a matter of justice. It's about doing right to those who will come after us, those who came before, and those members of the global community already suffering the effects of climate change today. It's far too late to avoid climate injustice. All that we can do now is reckon with the fact of it, with our own and others' climate-related perpetrations and experiences of suffering. In short, global climate change in the 21st century calls not only for prevention, but also practices of amelioration. Pete was kind enough to mention my recent book, and I argue there that many forms of environmental injustice and wrongdoings, including climate change, but also other forms of ecological degradation and destruction, animal abuse and exploitation, environmental racism, injustices against indigenous knowledge and knowers, are usefully understood as damaging our biotic relationships. And reckoning with it calls for processes and practices of relational repair. So I mentioned before that we need amelioration. And we could think about that in a few different ways. So we might think about what you'd call amelioration as relative improvement, doing better going forward than we have in the past. And certainly there is a huge place for this. You might think about targets of reducing greenhouse gas emissions as this sort of amelioration, doing better going forward than we have in the past. But even we might think about amelioration as relative improvement in explicitly moral or social terms. So just recognizing people as deserving of moral consideration that we didn't recognize before. Maybe taking seriously the idea that future generations are really to our reckoning with climate change, or taking seriously that our actions affect people all around the world in a way that we didn't before. That could be real moral improvement. And then we might also think about amelioration as what I call iterative adjustment, basically sort of learning from our past mistakes. And again, there's a huge place for this in terms of climate change and climate justice. So we might think about the IPCC reports as a version of this, right? Learning from our mistakes and making predictions for the future. And we might think about sort of the progress of global climate agreements as also an example of learning from our mistakes. But my suggestion is that we need more than amelioration as relative improvement and amelioration as iterative adjustment, important as those are, don't get me wrong. Amelioration as rectification, responding to the lingering wounds of the climate injustices themselves. And if you would, for a moment, think about a metaphor with my picture here on the right side of the screen. So it would be one thing to have fewer oil spills in the future than we have in the past. That would absolutely be a great thing. And it would also be a great thing to learn from past oil spills, from past corporate malfeasance, about how to avoid those things in the future. Again, fantastic. If that was all we did, and we didn't actually reckon with the wounds of oil spills themselves, with making right what has been made wrong, then we would definitely be falling short. And that's what I'm suggesting that we take seriously for climate change. And this is one place that restorative justice has so much to offer us. Now, my own work draws upon many scholars and practitioners of restorative justice and reparative justice. I would want to highlight especially American philosopher named Margaret Urban Walker, who's written about moral repair and reparative justice from an explicitly feminist perspective, and an indigenous Potawatomi scholar named Robin Wall Kimmer, a biologist and a scholar of indigenous knowledge, and particularly her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Now, just as restorative justice itself has a long tradition and also growing recognition today, there is growing recognition today among scholars and practitioners of the power and potential of environmental relational repair. So there have been some really exciting gatherings among scholars from across the world thinking about how is restorative justice relevant to thinking about our relationship to the environment and our relationship with each other in ways that are environmentally significant and impactful. And I think closer to home for me, some really exciting projects in terms of ecological restoration of sturgeon and restoration of other endangered populations, and how these kinds of restoration programs not only repair humans' relationship with the animals in question, but actually serve to repair relationships among human communities as well that have been damaged by previous overfishing. So these are my questions that I'd like to sort of focus on today. What makes restorative justice and restorative practices a good fit for climate justice? How can restorative practices make a difference to our collective response to climate change? And then maybe we'll end with this nagging concern in the back of our minds, which is, do we have time for this? Or are things moving too quickly? Is there no place for restorative climate justice, given the urgency of the climate question? Among those who discuss what to do given climate injustice, many otherwise worthwhile and insightful philosophical analyses often sort of neglect the question of relationality. And one notable exception to this is a Kiwi philosopher from New Zealand named Annette Beyer, who wrote a really interesting paper in the 80s called The Rights of Past and Future Persons, where she articulates this conception of a cross-generational community. Now, certainly Beyer isn't the only one to think this way. Even in terms of Western political theory, this goes back to folks like John Rawls in his Social Union Across Generations, or even Edmund Burke's Cross-Generational Community. But I'm really taken by the way that Annette Beyer discusses. She says, think of this as a community of beings who look before and after, who interpret the past in light of the present, who see the future as growing out of the past, and who see themselves as members of enduring families, nations, cultures, traditions. Okay. So if we think about our relationship to anthropogenic climate change as not merely a matter of harm, not merely a matter of wrong, but actually as affecting other members of this cross-generational community, I think that can be incredibly powerful in terms of how we respond and how we move forward. One feature of Beyer's cross-generational community that's worth emphasizing is that it includes past as well as future persons. So she says, for example, that our duty of sustainability to leave as much or as good of the public goods that previous generation have bequeathed us rises as much from a right of past persons to have their intentions respected as it does from the right of future persons. Now notice that the rights of past persons are not limited to the past. They're also forward-looking in the sense that they impose what Lucas Meyer calls surviving duties on those who come after. Now, in some sense, this might be kind of a mystery, right? Like, how can anything we do now really affect people who came before? And we might also think about our relationship to future people, right? How can anything that future people do really have any kind of effect on us? And Meyer makes this point. He says, it will be true of the past victims of injustices that they have the posthumous property that we fulfilled our surviving duty towards them. To be sure, a change of the relation between the currently living person and a dead person does not bring about or rely upon a real change of the latter person, of the dead person. Rather, the relational change is based upon the real change of the person who carried out the act. And I see this in our relationship to future people as well, that we can enact practices of relational repair, that we can enact practices of acknowledgement and apology and making amends. And that if we're successful, that future people can enter into a more healthy relationship with us. They can forgive us. They can continue on the practices that are important to us, and they can engage in trustful collaboration with the projects that we can begin but cannot complete ourselves. And perhaps we'll never know this. We'll never know whether our relationship with future people will be made more healthy by the practices of intergenerational restorative justice, but they can be made healthier all the same. All right, so one thing that I think makes restorative justice a really good fit for thinking about climate justice is that it avoids some of the conceptual and practical problems that would face us if we presumed a really kind of narrow harm-based account of what climate justice looks like, right? If we assume that basically climate wrongdoings are in terms of harm narrowly construed, and that responding to climate wrongdoings has to be about compensating for harm. Now, if we think about it in those narrow terms, my suggestion, right, is that restorative justice gives us a broader way of thinking about this that avoids these problems. If we think about the wrongs and harms of climate change in these narrow terms, then it gets us caught up in all kinds of thorny problems. So one of those problems is trying to attribute causal responsibility and then appropriate compensation for that causal responsibility. Because if we know anything about greenhouse gases, if we know anything about carbon emissions in the 21st century, it's that everything is deeply entangled, right? And the idea that we could sort of clearly disentangle my contributions and my level of responsibility, or even my country's contributions and my country's level of responsibility from the contributions of other individual and group actors is just hopelessly entangled. And that's a problem if our response to climate change is going to be narrowly construed as compensating those for what they have been, for what they've had taken away from them. Whereas restorative justice, and we'll talk about this more later, restorative justice doesn't have to be so limited to proportionate compensation. After all, the practices of restorative justice aren't about paying people back. It's not about restitution. It's about demonstrating our contrition, demonstrating our renewed trustworthiness, about demonstrating that we are accountable. It's about doing what victims of climate change need to see happen in order to repair our relationships. And those kinds of things don't require us to get into this messy business of who precisely is responsible for which elements of climate change. Now, this is part of the challenge and perhaps the limitation of certain legal actions and climate lawsuits that have been engaged in the past decade or so, which are really powerful. But oftentimes these lawsuits end in failure because they require demonstrating a precise level of causal responsibility, which is just made so difficult, right? And again, we can avoid that narrow construal on a restorative justice model. Another thing that a restorative justice model avoids, that narrow harm-based accounts of climate change have to fall into and really kind of muck about in, are some metaphysical and ethical complications. And we can talk about these more in the discussion if you want to. This is the kind of thing that philosophers tend to give a lot of weight to. But briefly said, part of the issue here is that if we have to understand climate wrongdoing in terms of individual persons being harmed, individual persons experience harm that they wouldn't have otherwise experienced. Well, if we construe it in those sort of familiar but specific terms, we get into some metaphysical problems, because the specific people that come into existence in the future may be different because of climate change than they would have been otherwise. You can think about this in a lot of ways. Think about the effects on migration that climate phenomena have, that people move around and they live in places and they have children that they would not have otherwise had. Philosophers, including the esteemed Derek Parfit, sort of discuss this as the non-identity problem for future generations. Now, that's a real thorny metaphysical complication if you have to think about climate change just in terms of like individual people being demonstrably harmed. But what's powerful about restorative justice is that we can conceptualize and respond to climate change not in such narrow terms, right? We can recognize that there are future generations who experience suffering. And we don't have to get into the business of individuals who would or would not have experienced suffering. We can think about this as a relationship of ourselves to future people, to future generations, in the same way that we can think about our relationship to existing people around the world who are also suffering from the experiences of climate change. This is another way in which I think restorative justice is a really good fit for reckoning with climate change, which is it actually enables us to engage in relational repair, not only with future people who are going to be affected by what we're doing, and not only with those who came before, whose projects we are deeply affecting, but also people right now living in this world who are reckoning with the social and ecological consequences of climate change. Now, from a narrowly term-based account, this may seem like it's making a kind of a fallacy, and this is something that many scholars and practitioners have pointed out, which is there is a temporal diffusion when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lag, right, between the time at which carbon emissions are emitted and the time at which those actually have a felt effect on people around the world, right? So just to put things a little bit simply, the kinds of demonstrable climate change effects that we are seeing today aren't being caused by carbon emissions today. They're not even being caused by carbon emissions from last year, right? They're being primarily caused by things that were done decades ago. And the temporal diffusion of the act itself and the time that it was felt is significant. That's one of the most unusual and specific aspects of greenhouse gas emissions and of climate change. So you might think that the idea that current perpetrators, those people, those of us who are responsible for climate emissions now, the idea that we have some kind of duties of reparation to people who are experiencing the suffering of climate change now, you might think that that's based on a kind of fallacy, right? We're sort of misconnecting who's responsible for what. But what's sort of powerful about restorative justice is that it enables us a way to recognize that we in fact do have duties of relational repair to people who are experiencing the harmful effects of climate change now. And that's true even if we ourselves are not directly causally responsible for those things. We can talk more about how this works, but just to put it briefly, what's relevant here is that I, as a perpetrator of climate change, I'm engaged in the very sort of harmful, wrongful activity that others who are experiencing the negative effects of climate change that's being suffered upon them. And the fact that I'm engaged in the same kind of wrongful activity is relevant, and it means that the relation that I have to people who are experiencing the effects of climate change also requires relational repair. So we don't just have to think about what we owe future people, but also to what we owe people right now who are experiencing the injustices, the same sort of injustices that we ourselves are responsible for. Last but not least, one thing that restorative justice can really enable is it allows us to acknowledge and recognize that there are other dimensions of climate injustice in addition to the narrowly construed elements of harm, right? Also questions of participatory justice and recognition justice, right? So who is allowed and enabled to participate in environmental decision-making? Who's allowed at the table and who is excluded? And not just who is allowed to participate in environmental decision-making, but also which values and which perspectives are they allowed to bring to the table? Perhaps, for example, your group is allowed to participate, but you'll have to participate on my terms, right? You're not allowed to bring your, for example, Indigenous valuations or Indigenous knowledge into our conversation. You yourself can come into the conversation, but you have to leave your values and your knowledge at the door. Well, these are questions that restorative justice can reckon with in a way that a narrowly harm-based conception might have a problem doing so. We can also talk about what philosophers sometimes call epistemic injustices. So ways in which we wrong each other in our capacities as knowers. Maybe, for example, I don't trust the things that you say, even though I should. Maybe I don't give you the credibility that you deserve because of stereotypes that I hold against you and people like you. Maybe, in fact, I don't even recognize you as a participant in collective knowledge making at all. I think of what you're doing as like mysticism or not real. And so I don't even think about you and people like you as a knower at all. These are other elements of climate injustice that restorative justice gives us the tools to not only respond to not only recognize, but also respond to. All right, so let me speak a little bit about how restorative practices can make a difference to how we approach and reckon with the fact of climate injustice. So one thing that I find very enabling and clarifying about restorative justice is the prioritization given to victims' subjectivities, which is to say victims' experiences, their perspectives, their needs, their own priorities and preferences. And another thing that is clarifying about restorative practices is that we aren't just focused on actions for their own sake, but on the meaning of these actions, right? So for example, making amends is not merely a kind of compensation or even a kind of partial compensation, but that making amends is about sending a kind of communicative message. It's an expressive act. So making amends demonstrates not only one's contrition, but the fact that one really is listening to what victims need to see happen in order for the relationship to be repaired. And so we can acknowledge not just actions, but crucial communicative acts like apology. And the goal here is not just to pay people back, but the goal is to renew relationships of reciprocity. The goal is to be able to trust each other again and to collaborate in projects again. So here's a nice little quote from Margaret Walker from a paper she wrote a few years ago. She says, reparations are a medium for the contentious yet hopeful negotiation in the present of proper recognition of the past and proper terms of relationship in the future. Oh, let me back up for a second. Okay, so think again about the members of your community that I asked you to reflect on before, who are or who will be especially affected by the social and ecological consequences of climate change. Perhaps you yourself are such a member of the community. And to whatever extent we ourselves are victims of climate injustice, we can enter into dialogue with perpetrators and other community members. We can take seriously perpetrators' apologies and amends or lack thereof. And we can speak to our own experiences and our own needs towards relational repair without drowning out the voices of other victims of climate change. And to the extent that we ourselves are perpetrators and contributors to anthropogenic climate change, we can listen to and find reparative direction in the perspectives of victims. We can acknowledge our own wrongdoings and make amends. And we can work towards dialogue and renewed trustful collaboration if and when victims are ready. And last, but certainly not least, as third-party community members, we have key roles to play in restorative practices towards climate justice as well, including our acknowledgement of victims' experiences, even if perpetrators of climate injustice don't make such acknowledgments. We can hold perpetrators accountable when they themselves are unwilling to do so. We can lift up and magnify the voices of victims, and we can work to anticipate. Now, to anticipate with all due humility and fallibility, we can work to anticipate the needs and priorities of future victims of climate change, future victims of present day contributions. Now, this can take us in a lot of directions, but one thing that it can allow us to do is it enables us to critique or in other contexts, defend particular proposals about what we should do going forward. So taking a restorative perspective can allow you to critique certain projects of climate adaptation, mitigation, or compensation. And alternatively, taking a restorative approach can allow you to defend or advocate for some such proposals. So if we consider, for example, something like building seawalls or climate refugees from low-lying areas, if we think about the need to pursue alternative energies as diverse as wind power or fracking or nuclear reactors, if we think about geoengineering proposals like strategic aerosols or ocean fertilization or geoengineering proposals of other kinds, in all of these questions, restorative climate justice directs us not only to consider the generic aggregate utility of such measures, but more specifically to think about the effects on and the perspectives of and the participation in decision-making processes of the varied victims of climate change, and to take direction from those things. So I thought it might be interesting for us to focus, for example, on what are sometimes called the Oxford principles that were articulated about 15 years ago by the geoengineering program at the Oxford Martin School. Now, I actually think that these principles are a pretty great place to start. But we might ask, how might these principles be revised or augmented, right? Addendum to these principles to better align with the values and practices of restorative justice? How might principles like these need to be revised to be more directed by the perspectives and subjectivities specifically of the victims of climate change, and not merely think about, say, public good as a generic aggregate utility? All right, one more way in which restorative practices make a difference is that to the extent that we are successful, we can rebuild trust and enable collaboration. And this is a good thing for its own sake in terms of human and biotic relationships, but also practically speaking, instrumentally speaking, rebuilding trust and enabling collaboration are going to be absolutely critical for responding to climate change. One way to see this is to think about the reverse, right? To think about the situation in which we try to move forward and we try to push forward, even though we haven't rebuilt trust, even though we haven't engaged in relational repair. We're going to need, for example, healthy, trustful collaboration if current and future people are going to participate in global climate agreements. We're going to need rebuilt trust and healthy collaboration if current and future peoples from around the world are going to adopt and not just have imposed upon them global scale climate mitigation and adaptation projects. Otherwise, the imposition of such projects is just further re-entrenching of climate injustices upon the very peoples who have experienced the brunt of it. We're going to need to rebuild trust with future people if they're going to continue and make crucial revisions to and changes of the kinds of cross-generational climate mitigation and adaptation projects that we're going to pursue. These are the kinds of projects that cannot be completed in a single generation. And so if we hope for future people to continue on the projects that we start, we're going to need to make it possible for them to trust us, for them to be able to actually hold themselves in healthy relationship to us, which means we have a lot of restorative work to do. And if, for example, we're actually going to recognize the value of indigenous knowledge to climate mitigation and adaptation, if we're actually going to apply, say, traditional ecological knowledges, then we're going to need to be able to rebuild trust with such knowers. Otherwise, this is one more example of the appropriation of knowledge from the very people who have been harmed by prior action. And what about climate reparations themselves? Well, if we're going to articulate what appropriate reparations for climate change looks like, then we're going to need to be able to have trustful collaboration among not only perpetrators and victims, but also third-party global community members in order to just make sense of what those mechanisms ought to be. So this brings us maybe just to a place to draw things to a close. So we might worry, given the urgency of climate change, that thinking about restorative justice is a distraction. You might say, this would be nice, all things considered, but we just don't have time for it. And I want to suggest that this sort of gets the relationship between climate amelioration and restorative justice wrong, right? It sees them as far less connected than in fact they are. And if we try to pursue various forms of climate amelioration without also engaging in relational repair, it's gonna risk undermining both. If we try to prioritize ecological problems without regard for relational ones, then what this is going to do is it's going to re-entrench and reify unresolved injustices. And if that happens, to the extent that it has happened before and it continues to happen now, it just makes it even harder for us to engage in trustful collaboration. And that kind of trustful collaboration is going to be critical for us and is critical for us at this very moment for us to make progress on a global problem like human-caused climate change. All right, that brings my remarks to a close. So I hope that we have a good amount of time for folks to ask questions and offer their own perspectives, whether it's in response to something that I said or on the topic of restorative practices and climate change more generally.
Lovely. So thank you very much, Ben, for fascinating talk. Uncomfortable, urgent moral questions for us living in the rich West. But really a really wonderful discussion about the relevance of restorative approaches in this climate crisis. So if anyone has a question or a comment, please chip in. You can just start speaking or put your hand up on Zoom if you prefer. Michael, you need to unmute yourself though.
At the end rather than beginning, could Ben just say a little bit more about how we begin to nourish this necessary relational, collaborative way of working? I mean, he emphasized this a great deal towards the end, the relation problems and not just the ecological problems. How do we start to foster that more than we do?
Yeah, good question, Michael. Not to avoid the question, right? But each of us wears different hats. To some extent, we are ourselves contributors to and perpetrators of climate change. But some of us, particularly the younger folks, are also victims of such things. And not just younger folks, of course. Climate change is an issue for the future, but it's an issue for people existing very much right now too. And so as we think about how to move forward, I think it's good to be thoughtful about the different hats that we wear, to the extent that we recognize ourselves as perpetrators of climate injustice. Then I think one of the things that's clarifying about taking a restorative approach is that we really need to listen to the voices of those who have been wronged. And so perhaps more than anything, we should start by genuinely seeking out the perspectives of the victims of climate change, and to ask ourselves, what are they asking for, right? And that might be people who are close to home. That might be people who are quite far away. We might look to example here in the US to youth-based movements like the Sunrise Movement, or in Europe and across the world like Climate Strike. I'm not suggesting that you need to limit your conversation with such groups. I'm offering sort of a more general suggestion that we can take our direction from those who have been wronged by climate change, and listening to their perspectives and listening to what they need to see is a place to start.
Ag, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask is, I know it sounds feeble, but are we the people to do this? I think of the kids on school strike, for example. They absolutely know what they want, and I want the same thing. There's no point in my asking them or them asking me to do it, because I can't. The people who need to be doing this are the people who've got some power. I mean, what I can do, because I edit a local magazine, so I can give them a voice to say what they want, and that's what I do. But it's nothing like enough. It's just a pitiful little piece of input.
Well, Ag, it sounds like there are things that you do. Can you tell us what is the name of your magazine?
It's very small. It's called The Sprout. It's you could call it a parish newsletter. It's about 40 pages long, but it goes free to every house in the area, and it's entirely done by volunteers. And it has, this coming month, November, in time for COP, it's going to be concentrating on small but collective local initiatives that will try and address the hideous problems.
That sounds really exciting. I mean, you're right, of course, that you can't do it on your own. And I don't know if this is a strength or a limitation. I think about, there are so many nested relationships that have been strained and damaged by human climate change, and that will continue to be as we move forward. And some of those relationships can be healed and repaired, and others may not. So I think the truth of it is that as a third party community member, right, you are raising the voices of the young folks that you are helping to publish. I mean, you could just give your own perspective, right? You could sort of center the Sprout on like how things seem to you. But you're going beyond that, because you're actually asking, what do the young people in my community, what do they see? What are they asking for? And how can I use my venue to lift up their voices? I think that's a huge step in the right direction.
Well, it feels very small in the grand scheme of things, you can imagine.
Tim, I think you were putting your hand up as well.
Yeah, very much, Ben. My assumption behind restorative processes is that both parties are aware of the harm,
yeah,
and acknowledge the harm.
Right.
I watched a rather long video about an oil company executives meeting with some First Nations people concerned with the tar sands in Alberta. And it was a very, very long process. I mean, I think it took 2 or 3 days for this discussion and dialogue to take place. And I really am unsure what was resolved in the end. There was some financial element, I think, but there was no commitment to stop harming. And that harm continues now. And implicated within that harm are the governments which recently got re-elected in Canada. You know, and they all claim to have green credentials and whatever, but the tar sands are killing and polluting that whole countryside. So I wonder really, are there any examples where perhaps this might have worked, where there has been some reconciliation and some understanding to stop the damage?
Yeah, you're right, because no matter what kind of lip service an individual or corporate entity might put to it, if they continue on in the same destructive practices, then what kind of accountability, what kind of acknowledgement is there? Right? It doesn't seem like there's anything. And I mean, it's so tempting, right? Particularly when we center these kinds of corporate actors, it's so tempting to say, let's not get hung up in who did what to who. Let's just try to do better moving forward, because it's more appealing for those corporate actors. But actually making acknowledgement means not just making small improvements, but acknowledging and being accountable for what's already been done by these corporate entities. Yeah, I think part of the challenge here is we're thinking about human relationships that have been strained, like interpersonal relationships that have been strained by climate change that we are complicit in. But we're also very much thinking about these corporate actors and their responsibility for it. And it may be the case, right, that what happens is that restorative practices allow us to strengthen the relevant interpersonal human relationships, while the corporate actors basically go unreconstructed, right? Because they're not actually willing to engage in amends. They're only willing to like throw some money at the problem. And we might see that as a shortcoming of restorative practices, but I guess I see it as like clarifying the difference between the kinds of reparation that individual communities want to engage in and are excited to engage in, and the kind of greenwashing that corporate actors would prefer. Tim had asked, are there successful examples of this happening so far? I think that's a great question. It definitely happens at the small scale level. But in terms of corporations actually doing this, I'm struggling to find it myself.
And Greta would say governments as well, because
Yeah.
the Canadian politicians are accountable as well in this matter, surely.
Yeah, that's right.
And again, I suppose all those who benefit from cheap petrol and cheap gas and cheap heating. So to some extent, the burden is very widely shared. So unless we're all willing to reduce our living standards, take responsibility, and live more simply altogether, to some extent, we're culpable.
I mean, personally speaking, I agree with you on all of that. Yeah.
I think, Alec, you had your hand up again.
Yes, I did. I was going to say that of course it is, and the people who voted for the government that did those things also have a responsibility. We're all part of it, and that's the trouble. We're absolutely enmeshed in this system, which seems to exist to destroy the planet. And how on earth how can we disentangle ourselves from it? We live in a country which has a government which is part of the system. Everything that we do is part of the system. The system is to destroy the planet. How come it's too big to change? Is it, I mean, I don't have huge hopes for COP because I can't see that there's anybody there who really wants it to change.
Before I respond, does anybody maybe want to build on what Ag said or respond to what Ag said?
Maybe Rosie?
Can I just ask you, Ben, that if you can't think of any examples where what you're advocating has changed things, what is that going to do to your own philosophy? And temperamentally, I go very much to, we haven't got time for all this. And we've got to find how to build up sufficient power, politically or whatever, to actually tackle the people with power, which is very, very non-restorative justice, I'm sure, and restorative principles. But it's challenging and frustrating to listen to you because, you know, I feel we really don't have time. And now you're saying you can't think of any way in which it really works. So comfort me.
Should we just hear from Rosie and then back to Ben for a response to both points?
Yeah, quickly, this probably won't comfort Michael, but just two reflections really from what I've heard. One is that in one of the sessions that Ben referenced in his presentation, in a seminar about New Zealand organised by Mediators Beyond Borders earlier this year, there was a fabulous description of a restorative response to a very particular environmental injustice to do with damage to a local habitat, where the giving voice to the indigenous population really surfaced that what they wanted by way of restoration was something quite different from what the corporates and the governments would otherwise have assumed to be the case. So that was that wasn't sort of if you like in response to what you might call big scale climate injustice. But I suppose I am also taken by Ben's point, which is that in the same way that Ag has been giving voice to victims locally, we can take that a bit further by then sort of engaging wider community members to say, okay, so what can we do as individuals? What do you, the wronged people, want us to do more of collectively to make our own, however minor contribution? I mean, it's modest, but we can help. We can enable them to hold us collectively to account, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yeah, Rosie, thank you for drawing our attention to the New Zealand example from quite recently. I think that's a great example where, like, even if the multinational corporate actors aren't participating, that the more local communities, including local government and local entities, can really make some relational repair. I guess I want to say Ag and Michael were kind of drawing our attention to a couple of different things. So just to go back to Ag for a moment, I'm sure we've all felt the appeal to try to disentangle ourselves from systems of injustice. But I guess what I would say, and I guess I mean this seriously, is disentangling ourselves from such systems. Is that what the victims of climate change need us to do? It might not be. They might say, we need you to actually operate from within your position. And that doesn't mean taking complicity as irrelevant, but rather than trying to disentangle yourself, you should try to act from the position that you're in. And when I say you, I want to apply that to myself as well. And I think Michael's challenge is a really good one. But two things, right? We're very much in this, right? I mean, if we're trying to draw historical inferences, the truth is, it hasn't been so long. I don't know that pessimism is any more warranted than optimism at this stage, just because we don't have a lot of historical track record to fall back on. But then the second thing is, we do need to build political power. I absolutely agree. But if we're not just going to build political power with people like us, if we're going to build a wider movement, then that means we have to engage in relational repair with those potential collaborators. They need to have reason to trust us. And by us, I don't mean like the British government or the American government or ExxonMobil. I mean like us who would join with them in political action. They need to have a lot more reason to be willing to trust us and collaborate with us than we've provided them so far. So I would suggest that even in terms of thinking about the need to build political action, in order to build it like a truly global and diverse, in terms of age and culture and geography, even to build a truly diverse coalition, we actually do need to engage in relational repair. Otherwise, it's going to be a monolithic entity imposing its perspective on those that they think well of, but aren't actually in collaboration with. It looks like Claire has a comment or a question.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to kind of acknowledge, I think often in these conversations, everyone kind of wants the quick fix, and everyone is aware of the pain and the horror that we face. And I've got like 2 young kids that I'm bringing up into this catastrophic situation and talking with them. And, there's just so much emotion around that, isn't that responsibility? But the last thing my kids need is hopelessness, and when no one's done it before. And so what's the point? When I talk with my kids and when we, on the strikes and, we're really supportive of our school strikes and different things, for me, that the hope really is that we can find a better way together, and it's through relationships. I mean, how we change these institutions, I think at the end of the day also has to be relational, because all these institutions are made up of people. So, we've all got our parts to play, but also the reality is there were quick fixes in the past, and that's partly what's got us into this mess. As humankind, we like those really simple things because we don't like this complexity of today. Yeah,
Claire, I think that's a really, really powerful way to kind of conclude our session today. Thank you for those very personal reflections, which I feel we all echo, and Ben's nodding. I just want to draw this to a close with huge thanks to Ben for what's been quite a journey in the last hour, and to all of you for coming in for your really strong challenge and good questions and reflections. Just to say, a reminder to fill out the evaluation form, if you would, that Joy's kindly put on the chat, and to flag up the next talk. So put this in your diaries, and again, it's in the chat, I think. 16th of November, we've got Dr. Mark Umbright. He'll be speaking on mindfulness, deep listening, and stories, the spiritual, in brackets, not religious, close brackets, core of restorative justice. So there's another event to look forward to coming up. Huge thanks again to Ben and to all of you, and have a really good afternoon. Thank you.